Good afternoon and welcome to this event, Nature Under the Hammer. Thank you very much for joining us at the RSE, either in person or online. We're really pleased to have you take part in this event, and we really look forward to you taking active part in this event. We want a proper, open discussion. It's one of the first events in the RSE's Curious Festival of Knowledge 2025. My name's Camilla Toulmin, and I have the pleasure of chairing this wonderful panel today. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. In the event of a fire alarm, we should all leave the building the way we came in and assemble outside the Dome in George Street, so that's round to the right. The fire escape routes, I think, are on the current slide, but please follow the RSE's staff directions who will show us where to go in the event of an evacuation. We're not expecting an alarm, but if a fire alarm does go off, then we need to exit through the back door. Well, having spent my professional life in the environment and development field, I can recognize the swings in approach that we've had to tackling problems in relation to environment and society. Swings from public to private sector, from big to small scale, from top down to bottom up. Market-based approaches, which is what we're looking at particularly this afternoon, market-based approaches to addressing environmental problems have been around for some time. I can remember a colleague of mine at IIED doing a big study of payments for watershed services around the world back in the early 2000s. And of course, there's been a market for carbon and carbon sequestration, which is a lot more active now than in the past. With current levels of public debt in both poor and rich countries at a high, the search is on for finding non-state sources of finance to plug the huge gaps between the scale of the challenges we face, whether with our land, climate, biodiversity, or oceans, and the public funds currently committed to address them. But can market-based methods actually deliver long-term, socially just solutions? And what evidence do we have that public funds can effectively leverage substantial amounts of private finance? Where is that evidence? What are the outcomes? And are there some other routes we could follow to get better results? These are some of the questions we want to address today. And we're very fortunate in having a great set of speakers who can unpack these questions and offer their ideas for how the climate and nature crises might be better handled. We won't be taking any questions during the 4 talks, which will run sequentially, so please keep any questions ready for once the speakers have finished. And then we very much want to open up to a discussion involving all of you. If the online audience have any questions, please type them into the chat, and we'll have these read out on your behalf to our speakers. So, without further ado, let me start by introducing our first speaker, who's Professor James Curran, who's a fellow RSE fellow. James is a meteorologist and oceanographer by training and a former CEO of SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. He's a visiting professor at Strathclyde University's Sustainable Development Centre, and a chair of Scottish Environment Link, and many other things besides. James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Camilla. It's a good start, isn't it? There we are. What's the challenge? Well, we've smashed through so many planetary boundaries over the last decades, particularly, as you can see on this diagram, for climate change, for biodiversity, for land use, and for fresh waters. And of course, all of those are interdependent. And the World Economic Forum, in its latest annual report, has given the top 4 global risks as extreme weather, climate, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse. You know, just one example is enough. I'm not going to go through more. This is the Living Planet Index, which astonishingly is based on monitoring 30,000 populations of 5,000 different species right around the world. And it's declined, as you can see, 70% in the last 50 years. It's unrelenting, and Scotland is certainly no exception. And there are big impacts, as I'm sure everyone here and online will know, expected from climate change on water resources, on agricultural productivity, on human well-being. And that can perhaps just be summed up in terms of that high-level metric, GDP. And this is a world map of the expected hit to GDP around the world. Many countries, the ones predominantly in red, will suffer GDP loss of at least 20%, some substantially more. And it says many governments in fiscal stress. Boy, is that a polite term for many countries will go bust. So, climate migration, I believe, is almost inevitable. The World Economic Forum, and again, suggests it could be 1.5 billion people on the move under a +3 degrees future world, which is what we're heading for. Some of those migrants will move within their own countries, of course, but many will be displaced outside their countries, and they are likely to seek refuge in countries that are safer, countries that are richer, and countries that have actually caused the problem. My own estimate there for Scotland is that we could see between 250,000 and 1.5 million climate migrants here by 2050. If you want more on that, there's some references at the end. You could see the article I wrote on that. So, to try and forestall that kind of future, developing countries need $300 billion every year to adapt to climate change. That's to put the systems and infrastructure in place that can allow people to live happily and stay within that country. So adaptation across the developing countries needs $300 billion per year. It's currently getting less than 10% of that. They also need funding for loss and damage. That's the damage that is already being done in those countries by climate change. That requires $400 billion per year. Again, less than 10% of that has been paid out in total so far, and that's $400 billion per year is needed. But just look at the total wealth that resides in private hands, $500 trillion. Puts those numbers in perspective, doesn't it? That amount of private wealth and availability for private investment dwarfs what is available for public funding. But tiny amounts of that private wealth is being mobilized, particularly for nature protection. COP15 mentioned here is the biodiversity equivalent of the better-known climate COPs. And it has recently made some fairly substantial statements and demands. And here it argues that $200 billion per year needs to be spent on biodiversity support and $500 billion per year for nature damaging subsidies to be removed. It's been stated, and this is controversial, and I'm sure others will bring it up later, that Scotland actually needs 20 billion over 10 years, so 2 billion a year, to recover its own biodiversity. And the Scottish Government is currently promising £500 million over 5 years. So why should we invest ethically and sustainably? Because, and it seems mad that we're not, because there are so many benefits and possibilities that will arise by investing ethically and sustainably. Sorry, I'm getting a bit lost here. But meanwhile, the world's largest banks, as you can see in one of the bullet points there, still invest $2.5 trillion each year in nature-damaging activities. And the G20 funds less than 1/4 of the nature-based solutions that it's reckoned we actually all need. And that's mad compared to the benefits that could be accrued by investing properly. The UK Climate Change Committee is quoted there, recently stated that GDP in the UK would actually benefit to the tune of 2% more under a future net zero. So I've talked about these nature-based solutions, and I'm sure we'll be discussing more of those during the afternoon. What are these nature-based solutions? They're solutions based on natural processes to tackle the kind of societal challenges that we all face. And I've listed some of them there. There are numerous examples, things like sustainable urban drainage systems, peatland restoration, natural flood management, sewage treatment using reed beds, and green roofs. And we know these answers. We do a little, but we need to do a lot. So to repeat Camilla's kind of opening question, we're here today to consider the question, can people, planet, and profit get along together? Thanks.
James, thanks very much, I think, for laying out so clearly the scale of the challenges, but also the beginnings of a whole number of possible ways forward. I'd like to turn now to Peter Young, who can amplify some of those points. He's an independent trustee chair and advisor to a number of bodies concerned with environmental regulation, markets, voluntary standards, and investment in nature. In particular, he co-founded the Aldersgate Group and the Broadway Initiative, which he currently chairs, along with the Nature Markets Dialogue process, which sounds absolutely center stage for our discussion today. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you, James, and good afternoon to everyone. So I want to pick up what James is saying and focus on nature and focus on what business could and should be doing to fund nature's recovery and what will get the money to pay for it. Because business finds the current array of initiatives and organisations and requests to help nature a bewildering barrier to invest. We all know nature is in trouble. We need to act urgently, and business is no different. Business is rapidly understanding its exposure to new risks triggered by nature's decline. Businesses also share common purpose in the benefits of resilient, nature-rich environments. They're desirable places to live. They attract increasingly mobile talent and skills. They make for accessible places for the workforce and supply chains. They result in healthier and more productive employees. And they reflect long-term thinking and stability, making it easier to invest. I mean, what's not to like? And I think business perhaps sees clearer than most that nature and climate risks are conjoined. I actually want to add one more underreported example that James knows well. Since 2008, decline of nature has been adding to our climate risk. What do I mean by that? Well, as recently as the 1960s, nature in our northern hemisphere was capturing 0.8% more carbon dioxide every year. That significantly slowed the cumulative effect of rising emissions. Now, nature sequesters 0.25, a quarter of a percent less as each year goes by. So nature is adding as another emitter. And this year, with the record number of wildfires in the northern hemisphere, it'll be even worse. It has a massive impact on climate risks, and yet it's one of the easiest trends to reverse. It's 4 years since Professor Dasgupta said in his review of the economics of biodiversity, and I quote, "Nature's worth to society, the true value of the various goods and services it provides is not reflected in market prices because much of it is open to all at no monetary charge." That work was sponsored by none less than the HM Treasury, who said that they would ensure nature's worth would be integrated into all UK policy making, and business actually stood by to see what that would mean. 4 years on, nothing. No clarity. Risks are rising, nature loss continues, and business is actually impatient to take action to protect itself from these market failures, the so-called tragedy of the commons. Because business knows that nature markets provide a mechanism to align economic interests with nature recovery, it enables the goods and services delivered by nature to be paid for by those who benefit from them, directly or indirectly. They also create economic growth and activity by themselves, and they require highly skilled, widely distributed and rewarding jobs. So what is in the way? Just try my first slide. I've gone the wrong way by the looks of it. No, that's James's. Let's have a look. Maybe one more. That'll do. Thank you. So, as was mentioned, last 18 months I've chaired something called the Nature Markets Dialogue. We've got 147 participating organisations, and we've worked hard to find the common ground to result in a clear ask for a properly regulated and governed nature market. I just want to talk a bit about that. I'll start by clarifying a few things about how I and business see nature markets. They do unlock investment needed to scale up nature restoration, and if designed properly, they allocate resources in the places that deliver the greatest benefit at the lowest cost. But there are a lot of things that nature markets are not. They're not an alternative to effective environmental regulation. They're not a substitute for public funding for the environment. They're not a way for business to avoid eliminating or minimising its own impact on the environment. They're not a pathway to privatise nature, and they're not a mechanism for greenwashing. Yet you'll recognise a lot of these things. They're happening in Scotland right now, and what it shows us is that nature markets are currently flawed. This is fundamentally a regulatory failure, not a market failure. The Nature Markets Dialogue showed that there were 5 elements to a robust and high-integrity market. Central is the need for market rules. That means everyone participating has to be registered and subject to compliance with those rules. And to support those rules, you need formal authorisation, accreditation, assurance procedures underpinned by standards. It starts by requiring each minister in each UK country setting up the legislation which allows an appropriate nature market scheme. It requires all the persons participating to register with the scheme, committing to those market rules as a condition of registration. And these market rules specify the market principles, the technical standards and approved metrics to be used for quantifying the benefits of nature-based projects and activities. Independent and rigorous compliance with the approved principles, standards and metrics would be set up through established bodies. There would be a board of the Nature Market Governance Scheme who would provide market assurance, overseeing and enforcing compliance, recommending amendments and maintaining a technical advisory group to review and advise on the scientific, economic and legal robustness of metrics, monitoring and market agreements. Enforcement will be underpinned by the board's capacity to suspend a market's registration for non-compliance or ultimately to deregister them, hence blocking them from the market and keeping the market integrity. It's a sort of diagram form of that. So just in conclusion, it's baffling to me why governments are so reluctant to act. The need for good governance and well-regulated environmental markets is not new. My first government commission report, which was back in 2007, was summed up in 3 words, really: long, loud and legal. In other words, you need some regulation behind it. In 2013, I sat on the Business-Led Ecosystem Markets Task Force, and our number 1 recommendation, hated by the then government, was to mandate biodiversity net gain for all development. In England, that recommendation, 12 years on, is stuttering into life. Scotland has yet to act. The Joint Nature Conservation Committee provides probably the best information we can get about where we are in the UK, and that shows UK public sector funding oscillates between 0.02% and 0.04%, i.e. not a lot of GDP over the last 20 years for biodiversity protection and restoration. And I think there's nothing in public finances which suggests a step change is credible. Spending by NGOs and philanthropists, particularly actually in Scotland, is increasing, but it's still modest by comparison. I've looked at progress since in 2021 the report on the finance gap for nature was published, and then Scotland needed an extra 8 billion, or as James said, 20 billion for the whole of the biodiversity thing, over the next 10 years. Using the data since 2021, so that's 4 years into that 10-year period, there's been about 250 million a year from the public sector increase. That's 2.5 billion over the 10 years, and about £500 million over the 10 years from the third and philanthropy sectors. The business sector is harder to estimate. Some might claim as much as 2.5 billion over the 2 years. I think 1.5 billion is more likely. If I add those numbers up, you end up with 4.5 billion, which is less than a quarter of the gap that was identified. So in other words, we've found probably a fifth to a quarter of what we need if we do all the things that we say we're doing. And I'd also point out this is based on the mandated requirements of improvement, which many think are inadequate. So it's not surprising our nature targets are being missed and net loss continues. We need a step change. We need it now. And the only way I can see we can find the money to fund it is from the private sector. So I believe the nature markets are the only solution, but I despair at the reluctance of governments to underpin those markets with clear, enforced regulation, instead relying on unregulated, disparate, inconsistent, piecemeal voluntary schemes which just add investment cost and attract the least scrupulous investors. The lack of any regulatory drivers to mandate nature investment is frightening away serious investors who fear the risk of being accused of greenwashing. Soon those players will abandon our market and focus on countries where nature markets are properly regulated and overseen. There are some. Australia's a good example. We must not let that happen in Scotland. We will lose our only chance to restore our nature. Thank you very much.
Great, Peter. Thank you very much. And in moving us onto the role of the state in making sure that markets can function properly. I'd like now to ask Matthew Crichton to speak. He's the Sustainable Economy Advisor to Friends of the Earth Scotland and Secretary of the Just Transition Partnership, which he set up with the Scottish TUC in 2016. He previously worked in local economic development in Edinburgh City and as an associate of the Learning and Work Institute. Matthew.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I'm going to take one of the questions we were asked head on. I'm going to basically put out a few bold contentions, which, if we're lucky, some people will challenge in the discussion, and I'll have to defend my position. Basically, the question that I'm looking at is this one of, can markets fix climate justice and nature? And my answer is very simple. Obviously not. I mean, why would you rely on a mechanism for fixing prices through the interaction of demand and supply to address our most critical social problems? I want you to just apply your mind to what they might be, and we'll sort of have a bit of a think about this. Think about pollution. Think about, for example, the possibility that someone might pour poison into a watercourse. Think about extinctions or the destruction of large amounts of tropical forest or whatever. Think about greenhouse gas emissions, which we know are having all the impacts which James has referred to. Think about inequality, wealth inequality. All of these things have, the things that they have in common, which I want to draw your attention to, is markets don't measure them. They are externalities. Secondly, on all of those issues, we don't say, it's all right to do these things if the price is right. We say, no, actually don't do that thing. That thing, pouring poisons or polluting a watercourse, is illegal. Anti-slavery campaigners never said, I wonder if we could just get the price for slavery right. It would probably be all right, right? So as I say, we say no. And of course, many people, we can have that debate, would say that the market system as it operates is actually at the root cause of some of these problems, precisely because all of those things which, it's about those markets and the companies operating in those markets not having to and not addressing those impacts which they have outside of the market effect. So I think this is balmy talk to suggest that it might do, and actually I think it's ideological, and I'll just quickly spell that out. For market mechanisms in these processes, read free markets, read the market system, and underpinning this is essentially the primacy of the right of asset owners to make a profit, even from the problems that they may have caused themselves. So not only is this, in my view, hard to defend, shall we say, it's posed in opposition to the much more obvious courses of action that you might take facing those problems, which are basically collective public actions. I'll come along to what some of them might be in a moment. Just to be clear, we're not talking about a slightly different question, which is, will markets play a role in the transition to a zero carbon and nature positive economy? That's an is the Pope a Catholic question, obviously. We live in a capitalist economy. But what I want you to remember is that aphorism that markets can be a good servant, but they're a bad master. And I just want to talk about some of those points in relation to climate change and in relation to nature. It's incredibly brief. I'll just chuck this stuff out there. Anyone can come back on it. On climate change, in my view, the failures to address the enormous systemic challenge of climate change have largely been due to an insistence of the role of market mechanisms in the way in which we tackle them. Since Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, in which the USA insisted that carbon trading be a key part of the outcome of those discussions, and then in the end didn't ratify it, by the way. But basically, since then, we've been living in that world, and the record is unimpressive. It is really shocking that greenhouse gas emissions globally are still increasing. So we've had a good run at this way of looking at things. I just got to add that locally, I would say that the failures of the Scottish government on its own climate change agenda, which we'll know about in terms of targets and so on, at the root of that is a neoliberal mindset, which is about the relationship between government and the private sector. The root of its failures are that it doesn't foreground the public actions which are necessary, but it basically says this has to be delivered through the private sector. Just on this question of the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, it's my strong view that to fix a problem like climate change and nature loss, we have to radically reset the relationship between the public and the private. And that's not always at odds with some of the stuff that Peter's talking about. From what I understand of business, we want clarity, we want certainty, and also what we need is a level playing field. We need that those businesses which are doing the right thing are not at a disadvantage in this market. As you say, it's about regulation. It's about our sort of, what we need is that good practice should become required standard practice. Very briefly on nature, because it's like so controversial, and I might be running over my time. Yeah, we've run through this argument. Like, there's a spending gap. We are not spending enough on conserving or protecting nature, and it doesn't look like there's a lot of chance of that coming through in the Scottish Government or UK Government's budgets in the near future. So we have this thing, oh, private investors have got a lot of money. They'll step in. If we struck the markets right. Now, with respect, genuine respect to what you say, Peter, as an overall solution, I think this is absurd. The challenges of creating those kind of markets in such a way that they could fill that gap they're too great, in my opinion. First point, just remember, there is no income stream from nature protection. That's why it's a problem. So the income has to come from selling credits. We all know that obviously buying and selling credits means that you're actually allowing someone else to do a bad thing where this good thing is happening. We actually need that sequestration for our own carbon accounting. The agricultural sector in Scotland is kind of hoping that because some of this stuff, the sequestration through forestry and peatland on soils will offset its own emissions. So through these trading processes, we're actually selling them to someone else somewhere else. And also, there's a lot more about why these things are incredibly hard to do. I don't think there's a methodology which reliably, and we can trust, which says we know the value of that bit of action on nature conservation. So it's very complicated, but when I get into these discussions, as I do with the Scottish Government sometimes and our environmental colleagues, I'm just trying to get a scale of the question, a scale of the issues. Because, to be quite frankly, in a pragmatic world, if despite my sort of principles, my gut feeling, I could believe that an enormous flow of money would be coming into nature conservation through these mechanisms, I would be saying, okay, well, I've got to hear that, I've got to listen to that. Even my experience is asking that question, how much money is flowing through these mechanisms right now into nature conservation? Nobody tells you. Nobody can tell you the answer to that question. I think I'm going to conclude on the conclusion is it's quite small and it will always be quite small. So whether these markets exist or not, how will they affect? We still have to address those other issues in other ways. And as I say, saying no or placing obligations on landowners that your peatland must not emit carbon dioxide. There are many other routes for government action other than creating markets. So I'm just going to finish on one line. We would therefore say this falls into the category of a false solution. A false solution is one where we say whether or not this will happen, it's not going to have an effect on a scale that allows you to not take the appropriate action. It's a bit like our view on carbon capture and storage. It might happen sometime, somewhere, some way, but it does not justify continuing to burn fossil fuels. So let's invest in the real solutions. That's my pitch.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hoped you would throw out some strong challenges to market-based solutions, and I think you've done just that. And maybe we can go into what some of the alternatives to pursue, saying, no, you can't do that, seeing how you can combine government regulation with effective enforcement. I'd like to turn to the last of our speakers, Satwat Raymond, who is co-chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. She's also chief executive of One Parent Families Scotland and has more than 30 years' experience in the voluntary and public sector. She's been a member of several commissions, including the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance for Scotland, and the Child Poverty Action Group UK. Satwat, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to follow on from what we've heard from the speakers before me, and the questions I've been asked to consider is whether private investment can really bring in the social and community aspects of the transition to net zero, whether it can be regulated to do so, and if so, would that ensure fairer return for our communities? With the Just Transition Commission over the past 2 years, we've been spending a lot of time in different parts of Scotland, looking at challenges of place, challenges of industries, challenges with biodiversity and nature loss, and listening to people about what they see the solutions can be and where people have identified solutions. We think it's really important to take that people and place-based approach as opposed to a sectoral approach, because what we're seeing is the cumulative impact of all these challenges and the changes that we need to make landing at the same time in communities. We've spoken to tenant farmers, gamekeepers, oil and gas workers, community wind farm owners, you know, the one sole volunteer in the community council who reads through all the papers before going to the meeting with the large forestry organisations to take them on and challenge them and get them to think about the local situation that they're in. And so for me, when we're talking about that question of what private investment can bring, I think at the heart of it, from what we've heard and seen, is that left to itself, private capital flows to wherever the highest return is. And that's one of the things that if we're wanting to think about how we regulate and markets and companies, we need to bear in mind. And as we had a roundtable on investment in the Just Transition Commission, and one of the attendees there, who was from a large finance, capital management company, said, international finance doesn't care about place. And I think that just gives us a sense of the challenge that we've got ahead of us. Because ultimately, a just transition is fundamentally about place. It's about people and place. It's about our communities, our workers, our children, our fairness. So unless we design the rules differently, communities do risk being left behind, and they already are being left behind. So I don't think you can leave it to the market alone. Unfortunately, as Matthew said, we're not in a situation where the dominant economic system internationally is going to change overnight. So it does then leave us with what can we do through market management, and what can we do with going back to some of those principles that should be at the heart of this work. We've spoken often about the polluter paying. We don't see that happen though, do we? We see communities bearing the cost. So there's lots of things here we can do differently. And I would argue that private investment could consider social and community aspects, but without regulation, without conditionality, it would only be if it also served profitability, risk management, or reputation. And even in some cases, as we've seen, reputation doesn't matter. If they want to pull out of an area, no matter what the consequences, they will do so, as we've seen in Grangemouth. So there are a number of things we can get into later that we could look at: impact investment, investing, green bonds and community funds, all of which I know tiny bits about, so I'm hoping my colleagues here will know more. So it is a case of how can we get private finance to engage with social value and at scale? And is it possible to do that without strong incentives or obligations? And I would argue it isn't, from what we've heard and seen. So we need to be thinking about what those incentives and obligations are. And I think governments need to remember who they're there to serve. They're not there to serve the interests of capital, but that is quite often how it feels. So in terms of regulation, governments do shape investment behaviours. They've done it in the past. They can do so again. We could require disclosure of climate and social risks. Europe's done that. We can expand, I can't say that word, fiduciary duties. So, for example, pension trustees must consider systemic risks to workers and communities and not just short-term returns. We can set standards that prevent greenwashing and define what truly counts as sustainable or fair investment. We can tie licenses, subsidies and tax incentives to conditions based on the principles of just transition and being nature positive. We could do that already, but we haven't done so yet. So here in Scotland, we can see some of it starting through things like the onshore wind sector deal, which has binding agreements for community benefit, the land reform bill, community wealth building bill, which we can all go on to look at if there's time. But what regulations or obligations would bring those fairer returns? Community benefit agreements? Who knows? Legally binding commitments, jobs apprenticeships, local ownership stakes, looking at some of the biodiversity loss and what we can do that, mandatory shared ownership, giving communities the right to take 10 to 20% equity stakes in projects supported by a Scottish Community Equity Fund, statutory community benefit floors, which aren't as low as what we have now, which is £5,000 per megawatt per year from renewable projects, which hasn't been index linked. So in real terms now is probably worth an awful lot less than when it was first introduced. So we would need to index link it again. And that they need to last the project lifetime. If what you're developing is over 50 years, the benefits have to flow for 50 years. Local benefit agreements, which can tie to planning consent, looking at investment delivering on housing, biodiversity projects, energy affordability, and mandatory social impact measurement. So these are some of the things that we could do. So returns aren't just judged by return on investment, but emissions reductions, biodiversity gains, and community well-being. All those things that were spoken of before as being externalities need to be brought in and be at the centre of the way we are designing the regulations and managing the market. And I just want to end with a few examples of where we've seen really good community-led practice and what could make it better. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Point in Sandwich Trust on the Isle of Lewis. We visited that. It's the world's largest community-owned wind farm, and its revenues have funded apprenticeships, fuel poverty reduction, hospice care. And it shows what happens when communities aren't just consulted, but own the assets themselves. That ownership has been translated into dignity, security, and reinvestment in local priorities. Secondly, when we visited Shetland, we went to the North Yell Development Council and the Garth Wind Farm. It was a small community idea in 2003 when residents decided their next project should be renewable energy. It took over a decade for volunteers to manage the environmental assessments, the planning applications, the grid negotiations, all on a shoestring budget. Actually, it was one man working non-stop over 12 years. Remarkable man when we met him, I must say, you know. And in 2017, the £8.3 million wind farm was finally commissioned, entirely loan financed, but entirely community owned. Now, the income from those turbines flows straight back into the community. It funds a staff team, local training grants, and a wide range of investments. A 28-berth marina at Cullivo Harbour, opening up tourism and sea angling. Community-owned shop and post office, because there was no shop on Yell. It's safeguarded essential services. We heard about how it's been able to invest in social care provision in the area. There's been affordable rental housing for local families and a COVID recovery scheme that provided every household with £400 in energy vouchers. By contrast, had Garth been developed by an external operator, the community would have received just £22,500 a year under the standard benefit guidance. Instead, they've guaranteed millions of pounds, powering not only the local grid, but economic and social renewal of their environment. And if we compare social value, community versus commercial projects, the Viking wind farm, which is owned by SSE on Shetland, is 443 megawatts. So it's almost 100 times the size of Garth Community Wind Farm, which is 4.5 megawatts. Yet the Viking development provides around 2.2 million per year in community benefit, which is about £96 per resident. Garth, by contrast, generates £2 million a year for a community of 250 people. That's about £8,000 per resident. So a project 100 times larger, commercially owned, delivers roughly the same cash to its community as a project 100 times smaller but community owned. And the lesson to me there is clear. Ownership really matters when we're talking about these things. And the same pattern holds elsewhere. A typical commercial development offers £5,000 per megawatt per year in voluntary community benefit payments. Highland Council has argued this is outdated and should rise to £12,500 per megawatt to reflect inflation and fairness. But you can just hear the arguments that will be made against that sort of increase. And that's what I think it's really important that we think about what mandatory measures we can use through conditionality, through regulatory frameworks, because this is not an anti-commercial argument. As we've heard, we don't have enough money available publicly unless we have a massive redistribution effort to undertake the scale of work we need to do. So we need private investment to deliver that. But we have to lock in fair value sharing through ownership, revenue share, or mandatory benefits. And I think if we don't, the social contract will break down and communities will rightly ask why their landscapes are transformed while fuel poverty remains stubbornly high, why their natural environment and resources are being exploited without there being a benefit to people and place. So these are complex models, but you know what we need? We need our leaders to be brave and bold and take some risks on this and stand up to big business and stand up to the commercial sector, because otherwise I truly think we're at risk of further leaving people behind. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Satwat. That was great in terms of providing also some very tangible examples of how things can work differently. I'd like now to turn to you, the audience, and people online to pose questions, engage in debate. Equally, if there are members of the panel who would like to pick up and argue with other members of the panel, please be my guest. So, who'd like to get the ball rolling? If you'd put up your hand and we can get you a mic. Anybody? Right, there's a woman in a blue and white spotted. Can you give your name just so that we know?
Can you hear me? Hi, my name's Anne Jacob Chandler, and thank you very much for those really insightful presentations. I have a question to the panel, and this probably cuts across what all of you have talked about. I was interested in your perspectives on TCFD and TNFD, and what do you think, whether you think that could potentially act as a catalyst for businesses to start thinking about the impact of climate-related risks, nature-related risks. I don't know if IFRS have started thinking about a TCSD in terms of the social impact, particularly in the context of climate migration, but very interested in your views on that. Thank you.
Angie, thanks very much for that question. Just for those of us who are acronymically challenged, please could you tell us what those mean?
Sorry, it's Anne Jacob Chandler, and it's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Nature Disclosures, and the question is, I wonder if there's a societal, social disclosures in the context of the people impact as well that IFRS is thinking about.
Great, thanks very much. Would anyone like to pick up? Peter, great.
Happy to talk to that, yeah. A good point. I mean, I think first thing, in terms of the specific one on nature, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the process they've gone through to come up with the reporting mechanism, I think, is actually a very good one. And I think that forward-looking business should assume that that will be mandated alongside the carbon reporting at some time in the future. I wish it was tomorrow, but it'll probably take some years to get there. Transparency is a really helpful tool in all of this, making businesses think about their dependencies and about their risks and about how they actually should adjust their investment so they're not adding to those risks and so that they're actually recognising those dependencies is really useful. But I think what you've hit upon is actually where we need to end up. All of these different reporting mechanisms are actually very disparate, and they fall into the category that what I said is sort of bewildering business at the moment. And why we can't have that holistic sustainability, rather in the way that Satwat described very well. You know, if we could just have that singularity. I'm old enough to remember the whole movement towards the initial sustainability reporting that came out of Rio in 1992. And the concept of that was spot on. The trouble is not a single government in the world mandated it, and it became a mechanism for greenwashing. And as a result of that, we lost trust, basically, in those reports because they were just written by marketing and advertising departments. What we need now, guess what I'm going to say? Properly regulated reporting, which means that we can rely on the evidence that's produced. And that should be across this piece: social, climate, nature, the whole environment sustainability piece. Not impossible. Some companies do it, but far too few.
Long, loud, and legal. Matthew, did you want to come in?
I like to say this. I agree with what Peter's just said. I'm just to have a little bit of a caveat, though. It was some years ago that I looked at TNFD, the nature one, and I don't know if it's changed, but I wasn't at all convinced it was able to do the job we need it to. It seemed that we were asking companies to identify the risks they were posing to nature without with a lot of loopholes, like they could choose which ones they highlighted. And so I'm not at all, I mean, it falls into this category of the difficulty of properly monitoring impacts on nature. That would be my comment. And also, just to clear, I don't think TCFD is it mandatory to anyone at the moment?
Yes, it is mandatory for certain large organisations.
Yes, so it's only very large organisations, but I think it should be generic. And just one last thing. I do agree with Peter, but just imagine, or let's anticipate the howls of protests from business when we come through with properly regulating reporting requirements, and let's just be ready to face them down.
James.
Yeah, I was going to disagree with my good friend Peter, I think, but there's probably some common ground, and with Matthew. Yeah, transparency. I mean, I've spent most of my life as a regulator, an environmental regulator, and transparency is the weakest form of regulation you could possibly imagine. It's predicated fundamentally, even some aspects of it are voluntary, but it's predicated on anybody caring. You can be transparent, but what if nobody cares? I mean, I said in my little introduction, the world's largest banks are still investing $2.5 trillion a year in nature-damaging activities. It's known they're nature-damaging, but nobody cares. So it is an appalling form of regulation, and it's just not worth the paper it's written on. But I would automatically, instinctively pull the regulatory lever, particularly when we're in the emergency situation we're in. It's declared as a climate emergency. It's declared as a nature crisis. They're both emergencies. So we need something quite dramatic, and I will make a particular proposal. It's not in Scotland's power to do this, but the UK could, particularly now we're no longer in Europe. Section 172 of the UK Companies Act is all about the duty on directors of companies. And as we well know, the fundamental duty is just to make as much money as you can for your shareholders or yourself. There is in there as well that in decisions made, they should have regard to communities and impact on the environment. There's another weaselly regulatory term, have regard to. It's, again, not worth the paper it's written on. So I would suggest that Section 172 of the UK Companies Act should be amended, and it would be a 2-line amendment that every decision a company director makes must demonstrably, that's important, deliver maximum benefit to communities, climate, biodiversity, and resource use. Then there'd be nothing bad for people to invest in.
Thank you for that very helpful recommendation. And yeah, we can make that, I'm sure that Keir Starmer, having nothing else on his agenda at the moment, will firmly take that on board, but we should certainly get it into the agenda for the pre-Holyrood election process. Satwa.
Absolutely. I can just see the members of the new cabinet looking at that just as we speak. Yeah, absolutely. The only things I wanted to add very quickly was what I feel is lacking in the debates that are taking place, not here, but at other levels, is any sense of urgency about this. Do you know, we are missing target after target. People are finding all sorts of reasons to explain the changes we're seeing in the climate and in the weather, anything but admit what it is that's causing it. And so I think part of what we need to be doing, irrespective of the regulatory framework or all those things, anything, is to get that sense of this needs to be done now, firmly, you know, at the fore of people's minds. I don't know how we do that with some of the big business, especially when there seem to be teams of people who want to do nothing more than counter anything that's coming out and are deniers about all what's happening, and the culture war that we're beginning to see happen around that. So sorry, that's a bit of doom and gloom. But in terms of your question, coming back to you, And it was about, I think, what we don't have are the metrics. How do we know what the impact is? Do you know, what is the framework that we're going to be using? And for me, most importantly, who's going to be involved in designing and determining what those outcome measures are? So then it gets away from it being just about the quickest return or profit to some of the things that we've heard Peter, Matthew and James talk about.
Thank you. Can I see any other hands going up? Lady in the stripes, right at the back.
Thank you. The name's Anne Edwards, and I'm just wondering how seriously you take the threat from political parties like Reform and the Conservatives who are promising to ditch net zero.
Anybody want to pick that up? Peter?
Yeah, extremely seriously. I think we have a large proportion of the population who are very happy to vote for selfishness. And I think what we see in that decision and many other decisions from particularly the strength of Reform, but actually across a lot of the political spectrum to try and garner votes, is to pander towards selfishness. And any of these problems we're talking about, climate, nature, but also a whole range of other social things, do require this cohesion of society to work together to make a better place. And they're not interested in that. They're only interested in serving the individual. So I take it very seriously, and I think we only have to look across to America to see the consequences.
And I think we also need to take seriously the threat from the US administration to impose harsh economic measures on those countries that do try and advance on the climate agenda, and things like the proposed marine fuels levy and so on. No, it's a very worrying time. Satwat.
Thank you, Annie. I think that was what I'd started to talk about in the last one, because I do think that there is a very tangible threat from Reform and the Conservatives when it comes to climate action and what we need to do. Not only because certainly with Reform you can see how the ideology they're following is flowing straight from the States, and some of the right-wing think tanks that there are in the States that are feeding into Trump and also into Farage and Reform. And with Conservatives, it's always been about supporting business to make profit, you know, and it's what we've seen, though, as a result of that now and where we are is a complete lack of trust and a breakdown of trust in our politicians and our political systems. And that's where, you know, when we've been out speaking to people around the country and we've asked them about, well, where would you go for information? Who would you trust about these things? Surprisingly, when it came to some of it around, for example, what type of schemes are available to help you with retrofitting, insulation, ventilation, nobody spoke about going to the government website. Do you know? Nobody spoke about going to any of those public information sources that we have. More than one person independently across the country spoke about they'd go to Money Saving Expert. You know? And to me, that speaks volumes in terms of what we have to do here to rebuild trust. So what is being said, which is credible, people believe. Because what we're seeing at the moment is possibly led by selfishness, maybe by fear, I don't know what, certainly by self-interest. People are believing what fits their worldview. You know, they don't want that challenged. And where we've seen that being most effectively challenged is on a very local level. And I think so part of what we need to do is to go back to those good old days of community development, being in communities, understanding what the issues are, and being able to address those issues, and for people to begin to see the links between the big climate issues we're addressing and what's happening to them in their communities. I don't think we can get around it any other way, because that relationship of trust has been so badly broken.
Thank you very much. James.
Yeah, I can really only look at this in a very kind of local way, and I'm not being party political at all, at least I hope not. but I feel certainly here in Scotland, some of that lack of trust and lack of confidence is as a result of very, very poor delivery from government. Yep. I mean, I would give credit to the Scottish Government over many years now of having the right rhetoric, saying the right things. A lot of their strategies and policies, from my perspective, looking at sustainable development and the environment and nature, are good. They say the right things, but year after year after year, it's not delivered. And I think people begin to lose confidence, begin to lose trust, and then they'll look around for someone else to vote for. And I'm going to be non-political, so I'll stop myself saying any more on that. So the answer to me that anyone in power should really be seeking is delivery. Delivery, delivery, delivery. Get on and deliver. Deliver what you say you're going to do. Deliver what you say you want done. And to me, that is pretty simple. Again, it's my professional background. Put in really solid professional programme management. That never happens. Scottish Government comes out with a strategy and then it's over to you guys. That's for you. Yeah, life doesn't work like that. Follow it up with professional programme management and all that that entails, and I could go on about this for an hour. And it's beginning to appear in London with Chris Stark appointed as the mission lead for renewable energy development. It's just another word, to my mind, for robust professional programme management that will guarantee deliver. If you begin to deliver, I think people will get trust back, and then they won't search for strange parties to vote for.
And I just wanted to add one thing to what you said, and that is, if that means you have to be unpopular in order to deliver in certain circles, you still have to do it. And the example of that I think it was last year, not this year's book festival, I had the pleasure of hearing Sadiq Khan speak about his book Breathe and his campaign that he had for the ULEZ in London, and then the extension of the ULEZ and the amount of opposition that there was to there. But it was knowing, he said, that it was the right thing to do. Air pollution in London was so bad. We'd had the awful case of the young girl in southeast London who lived near the South Circular Road, who actually had, the fact that it was pollution, air pollution, on her death certificate as the cause of death. So he worked closely with her mum. But when I asked about, well, how did you get, because the press were against you, the national government was against you, businesses were against you, what did you do? And he says, we went right back down into local communities and started building up from there. But also, he said, we knew we had to do it, even though it was unpopular, because there would be benefits people would begin to see very quickly. And so I think there is that thing about politicians need to be prepared to be unpopular. And, this is not some sort of popularity, it's not reality TV, it's not Big Brother, but that's how it feels like at times. They're all just they're all thinking about themselves and getting themselves voted back in, as opposed to thinking about what do we need to do. And actually, in some cases, you might need to take a risk and do something, even though it's unpopular. But actually, the benefits are too great for you not to do it. So I think we need a bit more bravery from our politicians as well.
Great. Thanks, Edward. Yes, Matthew, shortly.
Yeah, shortly, if I can. It's not my nature. Picking up from actually both of those or all the contributions, what you said, Peter, I just wanted to talk about the foundation of the capacity to question net zero policies, and it's to do with people not seeing the benefits. Because obviously the irony is that, as it's been pointed out, an investment program in renewable energy and green energy can transform our country and make people better off and cheaper bills, etc. I want to talk very specifically about the experiences of workers in the offshore industry and the sense in which they feel betrayed by the agenda of just transition, and they feel that they're being made redundant. Actually, they're being made redundant, I believe, mostly because the oil price is low, but we're being told it was because of climate policy, and they're not finding that transition, that opportunity to move into those new jobs is available. And there are two things which we can really bring to the government, set before the government on this. The first is that there is actually no sort of training or skills-based support for those workers, which is absolutely astonishing. How you can, ignore it's a core Scottish government responsibility. But the other thing is the record of creating jobs from this enormous amount of investment in Scotland is terrible. There aren't enough of those jobs, and that's because we are in this neoliberal economy in which profit and jobs are sucked out of our country, and they go to Spain. I mean, I don't blame any of those countries, but we don't hold on to any of that stuff at all, and it's partly because of this failure of the Scottish and the UK government to make very, very clear requirements of the companies who are investing in this country. It's just a free, it's like, come in, take our money, take our wind, take your profits home. And so, ownership as well. If we owned energy, if we owned the wind, we could then run it better ourselves. So, I take it very seriously, and I actually, as well as pointing a finger at the government, I should, of course, point a finger at the oil companies themselves who are making these people redundant without any provision whatsoever to support them either. So it's not just the government's fault.
Thank you. I hope that's given you some answers to your question. Now, I think there were a whole number of questions, so I'm going to take three, and then we'll just make sure that people have got the chance of asking questions. So, hands up. Let's have at least three hands. Gentleman here in a blue shirt, gentleman here in a jacket, lady here in a raincoat.
Hi. No, thank you very much for the discussion. And listening to these interaction, one of the clear things is that feeling of that sense of justice, that sense of people's wanting to participate. And a lot of the problems one sees is about free riding, other people getting the benefit. We started with the transfer from richer countries to poorer countries. Transparency with the company reporting, I can see the problem in that, but in policy transparency and simplicity, the policy that I keep seeing is like the carbon border adjustment tax, carbon taxes. It was brought up that markets make good servants, bad masters. Can we not use that simplicity? The Britain sort of taking it, will be implementing it, but how can we fit that into this discussion? Because it strikes me that if we're talking about markets and sort of the financing of this, comments on improving that policy or developing it or just how it fits into the conversation, because I hadn't heard it mentioned.
Great. Let's get, I think this gentleman here in the, a man in a jacket.
Just refer to my notes. Is there, in the view of the panel, is there a realistic prospect of a criminal prosecution of an individual for crimes against the environment? I'm thinking of a politician or a large-scale landowner, bearing in mind the challenges with successfully prosecuting crimes against humanity. And would any of the panel like to comment?
Thank you. And yes, lady in a white Mac.
Hi, thank you. So we've spoken a lot about community, which I've really appreciated as someone who grew up in a 1,000 person strong village on the west of Scotland. But what I wanted to ask is a question coming from a biological scientist, as I've just graduated in that field. I wanted to ask, how can we integrate the scientific community and more widely other communities with that of the economical or marketable and social communities? I mean, I spent a whole 4 years studying science, and we barely ever talked about the impact of the markets on environmentalism. So I'm just asking if anyone would like to comment on how they believe in the future we can interweave the two more strongly, because I think that would be of great benefit in the future.
Great, thanks. Okay, so panel, who'd like to start? Choose which question if you want to give a rapid, Matthew.
If I choose one, that means I don't have to answer the other ones I find harder. I got in quickly. The question about criminal prosecutions for crimes against the environment, I I first of all think it's very unlikely under existing legislation, but you probably know that Monica Lennon, MSP, is seeking to introduce a bill into the Scottish Parliament which makes ecocide a crime. And it is obviously that covers the deliberate, conscious action to do damage to the environment. And she judges, and I think it's true, that we need to spell that out in law as a specific offence for that to happen. Of course, it doesn't even mean it will happen. It means that the threat of it happening would actually be helpful. And so I would, if anyone has, I believe that Monica's bill has got the support of the Scottish Government, and therefore we should help it get through. So let's fingers crossed on that one, and that's take that one off.
Separate, yeah. And then
I'm going to choose that same one, right? I know. I think what Matthew has said is absolutely right, and we do have an opportunity here in Scotland. I just want to say, though, that one of the things that we've seen happening more and more has been a complete erosion in the power and value of international law and international institutions. I mean, you spoke about humanitarian, you know, I'm assuming you're talking about some of the horrendous situations we've got going on, for example, in Gaza and in Ukraine. And if where something is so crystal clear and happening and being broadcast every single day, and we can't get anything to happen internationally because actually our institutions are too weak because we still ultimately believe in the sovereignty of the nation state. You know, nation states are sovereign. I think it's highly unlikely that we would see anything happening through international courts that would be taking on some of those incredibly large multinational corporations who can wheedle out of national law and worm their way around international law by placing themselves in different places. So I think it's fundamentally flawed at an international level, and it's one of the things we really need to be looking to see how we strengthen.
Yeah, I'd like to, I think, maybe rather tenuously pick up on the other two comments that are really interesting and just sparked some thoughts in my mind. One is a blatant plug, I suppose. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde, and I was in there the other day. They are going to be one of the leading universities in the world that will make it an absolute obligation on everyone on a taught course right across the whole university to be exposed to the elements of sustainable development and sustainability. So every graduate will understand the admittedly complex interactions between society, economy, and the environment. That's pretty impressive, I think, for a university that is very heavily engineering dominated. Great stuff. But that's just graduates. What about wider community? I was actually a founding member of the European Citizen Science Association, so I'm a great believer that every one of us can actually contribute to, particularly from my background, understanding the environment by going out there and measuring it. And there are lots of ways you can get involved in that. And by going out and observing nature, connecting a bit more with nature, then people begin to have that sense of commitment and that sense of responsibility to protect it. And boy, we need a lot more of that right across society. So, yeah, but this is where I'm always conflicted in my own mind. I mean, this panel has very different views about many aspects of this question we're addressing this afternoon. I said earlier that I'm a great believer in really professional, robust program management. That means centralizing and leading in order to deliver, which is rather the opposite of where you would come from, because you are very much community-based, and I'm very much, I'm sorry, top-down, just make it happen. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to qualify that because another proposal I have in my mind is that Scotland really desperately needs a land and sea delivery agency. And that would simplify because the whole spectrum of activity across nature and climate in Scotland is so fragmented. You know, there are tiny little grants going here, there and everywhere delivered from government. There are bigger grant awarding schemes go through about half a dozen different agencies. And as I said earlier, nothing ends up getting delivered because we don't properly prioritise and we don't really use that money to the best purposes strategically at the national level. So I would argue that we need one agency that collects all of that money, and that includes agricultural grants, by the way, forestry grants, land reform grants, everything through one agency to take a really national strategic view, deploy that money in the best possible way to get the best possible bang for buck. That might suggest communities get left out of it. But I would argue, actually, if there's one agency that you know to go to, then it can actually learn how to get communities involved at the grassroots level much more effectively than the kind of scattergun, fragmented approach we currently have.
Good. Well, I'm glad we're getting a whole number of proposals for what the Scottish and UK government need to do. That'll make a great agenda for us to push. Peter.
Yeah, I just want to pick up. I mean, one of my favourite topics, I think you mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, actually, why stop there? Our whole tax system is at the moment biased towards the wrong objectives. And one of the biggest barriers that I've grown many grey hairs over is trying to get Treasury to be a forward-thinking organisation. And our government treasuries are not. They're backward-looking. And that is a major, major problem. We continue to subsidise fossil fuels. You know, people talk about, things like red diesel, for example. You know, that's actually a sort of trying to help farmers. No, it's not. What it's doing is it's forcing farmers to remain in full fossil fuel use and not actually to move to sustainable mechanisation, which we could have easily reached if we'd had a different policy. I could go on and on, but there's so many aspects to it. We basically tax bad things to get the right outcome. But instead, what we do is we tax the good things and we actually reward people who do the bad things. It's astounding how far off our tax system is in meeting things. And so there are lots and lots of things we could do on the climate and nature and other agendas to that. But I'll stop there. I do want to just sort of briefly mention a couple of other things. I think it's worth saying that not only do we not have the international institutions' strength, they're probably at the weakest they've been since the Second World War at the moment, and that is a major problem for many of the sort of justice issues, if you like, we have. But it's not just that, it's also the fact that the legal profession generally is tipped very much in favour of the wealthy. So it's very hard to get an even playing field, even when you can pick a fight legally, and I think that's a major barrier. And just lastly, a comment about, you know, coming back to the sort of community side and the like, linking it into the taxation. What we don't do is we don't look at the true value assets that we have in our locality and allocate that to our locality, and then actually get the locality to be able to benefit from enhancing those assets, and that would particularly help us in terms of biodiversity. We've got to change that attitude towards our taxation, and our rewards relate to ownership, and ownership does not have to be where that asset is. It's the people who live and work and exist in the location who should be the prime holders, not some faceless organisation which is miles away and has no understanding because it's just a number on a page.
Satwat, I know you wanted to come
Just
back in.
following up on your point, James. I think one of the issues, though, is with the top-down is it depends who's there designing it. Who's at the top and whether they know what they don't know. And quite often they don't. Do you know? So what you then get is bad design which isn't working in local levels and in communities. So whilst I have no issue with there being a strategic sort of delivery mechanism that would work across Scotland, I think how that's designed and shaped needs to be done alongside people and communities and not imposed on them. And my challenge back to you, I suppose, would be we have lots of national bodies who aren't doing anything, who aren't delivering. What would make this different?
Well, that may be a conversation
Sorry.
that we'll need to have outside. In the last 10 minutes that we've got here, I'd like to get 3 more short questions for the panel to feed back on. And then if people want to stay behind and collar any of our speakers, I'm sure they'll be able to be free for 10, 15 minutes afterwards. So let's have 3 more short questions. Gentlemen towards the back, another one in a white shirt. And a woman, yeah, you've been very patient, woman in a blue top. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. Lewis Shan Smith. This has been fascinating. I'm not sure whether I'm encouraged or depressed by it, and I have a whole lot of thoughts and questions just scrambling across my brain from left to right and back again. But I think the final question that I have out of all of that is, you've managed to identify the problems, you've also identified some of the solutions, but how do we make it happen? And especially when we have a government that's saying we'll grow by deregulation.
Hi, Nick Rogerson. Just going back to nature markets, one way of looking at them is being compliance or voluntary basis. A voluntary market being one where individuals and businesses agree to trade goods and bads, whereas a compliance market, the state or someone has obliged the individual committing the bad to go out and find an offsetting good. I wonder if the panel has a view on the place of voluntary markets where it's based on good intentions rather than being compelled to do one thing or the other.
Great, thank you. And yes, we've got this lady just here. Yeah.
Sorry. What does the panel think about the possibility of people in the very north of Scotland whose land is, and their environment, their good health and everything else is being hurt in different ways by seeing so many wind farms being produced over the last 10 years. There's now a 10 billion scheme in Caithness, which will then go all the way to London and wherever else. They are paying more for their electricity than they are in London. Not only that, the people themselves are up in arms against this because they are given projects that they can apply for from all the wind farms, but there are conditions. And that is like a ransom on each one of these. And if you object, then there's less chance of you ever getting money to put that project forward. Now that is the destruction of communities, which the lady herself has been explaining. That is actually a community which is a small communities, and they're trying their best to live in a place where the balance of the countryside, we're sitting with people with these wind farms on the edge of the peatland, on a World Heritage site, and nobody's doing anything about it. Great. What do you see? But people should be living a much simpler life. Our electricity, we're using so much for technology, and it's time to maybe start to think a wee bit more disciplined.
Thank you very much. I can see James very keen to come in. Let's make it fairly short.
Yeah, I'll try. Lovely discussion. I mean, so many ideas going through my head at the same time. How how to make it happen. Should I pick up on that one first?
Yeah, we'd like to know the answer.
Yes. Well, the government itself says it wants to rearrange the deck chairs, you could say. It wants to review the public sector delivery mechanisms. So now is the perfect time in the run-up to the Scottish election. Let's have the government, because it's under the microscope for failing to deliver, coming up with new mechanisms, new schemes in order to deliver. And I believe that is perfectly possible. And as I say, I would love to see some of these things, really radical changes happening. Voluntary or compliance. You know, Peter, way back at the beginning, mentioned biodiversity net gain stuttering into life in England. If you look at the planning legislation in Scotland, it's voluntary here. Local authorities can insist on biodiversity net gain for any development. They don't do it. I don't know of an example, maybe there is, but yeah, it has to be compliance-based, not voluntary, because if it's voluntary, it just doesn't happen. And then the too many wind farm one, yeah, I mean, I really sympathise. I don't really have an answer to that, but the thought it raises in my mind is everything being biased towards the big companies, the rich, and in this case, the utilities. The utilities have so many legal powers of way leaves to put pylons up, and I am not against renewable energy, don't get me wrong. There is no comparable power amongst the public bodies to have way leaves for nature, to join up fragmented habitats. I mean, it just doesn't exist. Why?
Thank you. On the how do we make all this happen? I think we've got an opportunity in Scotland with an election coming up next year. I think we need to get these issues higher up the agenda of all the political parties and the discussions and the debates we're having. What I've also seen on the ground as we've been in different parts of the country has been the most incredible stuff happening. But what we don't have are the mechanisms to look to see how that could be scaled up. You know, what more could be done, whether it's transferable to other areas. Community, you know, we don't have the mechanisms for communities to work together across Scotland in that way anymore, like there were before. So I see a lot of fantastic work happening at very local level and at regional level, but what you don't see is a recognition of that and a recognition of that approach being something that could actually add a lot of value to the work that we need to do. I've seen great local fuel poverty reduction schemes, for example. I mean, ideally, we wouldn't need those local fuel poverty reduction schemes if we managed to get the market right and the costs of energy right. But at the moment, people are responding really creatively and they're taking risks. And again, it goes back to the fact that we've got a very staid, risk-averse set of governments at the moment when it comes to do anything which they think they can be challenged on around nature and climate. So that would be one thing I do think that we need to pick on the examples. And actually, we're having a summit on the 29th of October. Forgot to say that earlier, for the Just Transition Commission. And as part of that, we've been gathering case studies from across Scotland, and they'll be showcased there. So you can see some of the excellent work that happens when communities collaborate and work in partnership across agencies. And I'll come on to Caithness, because we visited there very recently, the Just Transition Commission, and we had public meetings in Wick. We also spoke to people in Thurso, but people came from right across Caithness to come. We had some who were very proud of the fact that they're able to provide so much of the energy that's required. We had others who were incredibly frustrated at the lack of compensatory mechanisms and other things that would support them to have the local mechanisms, for example, to maybe look at how they can subsidise people's energy costs while we look to see how we make it a fairer system across the grid. And that's one of those areas where I think what we don't see enough of is the UK government and the Scottish government working together to address these issues, because otherwise what we'll hear is that's reserved, we can't do anything about that. Well, if that's reserved and affecting your communities, you have a duty to do something about that, and by going and listening to those communities. So it's not an ideal solution, but I do think we need compensatory mechanisms to be much stronger, regulated, mandated, and for community to have control of that in terms of how it's used locally. At the same time, I know there's a big shift now towards offshore. We actually visited the control room of Beatrice, which is one of the large offshore wind farms. And what I heard in Caithness, and I think the government hears this now as well, is, do you know, we're at capacity, we're saturated now with onshore wind farms. Please don't put any more here.
Great, thanks, Setra. I'm going to prevail on your patience and have another 2 minutes to make sure we get feedback from both Peter and Matthew. Peter.
Okay. Thank you. Well, yeah, lots of things. Firstly, how do we make it happen? Well, the one thing I would say here is I'd like to see more responsibility given to authoritative science and evidence-led parties. You know, at the moment, we haven't quite reached the low level where parties are arguing whether or not murder is a good or a bad idea. They all agree that deciding what the punishment for murder is something that should be left to professionals and experts who can allocate what is the appropriate level of punishment. We all know that climate is an emergency. We all know that environment degradation is not right. A lot of these issues in sustainability are common goods that ought to be passed not into political footballs but to some kind of thing. And if we could get that set up in the right way, do I have confidence we can do it? No, but that's what we should be doing. In terms of voluntary markets, I think it's all been said. Yeah, I've had loads of experience of that. The only time a voluntary market has worked is when a government has been serious that it's going to put a horrendous bit of legislation in place and the industry really believes it. And then sometimes they do a better one ahead of the government. And at the moment, they don't usually believe the government. They think they can string them along. So voluntary markets are pretty pathetic, I'm afraid. But they can have a bit of help, but they're not the answer. I do want to say just a little bit about the Caithness thing. I live in Ross-shire, and I mean, do you know, I stare out and watch the wind farms, which I can see from my house, and very often they're switched off. And did you know you're paying the companies who have those wind farms to switch them off because they can't use the electricity or fit them in the current lines? Now, that's just a good example of how such weak and bad regulation we've got. If those companies were told that they can only sell the electricity we can use, but if they'd like to find ways of using more of it, then they'd be very welcome to use that. That way, they'd actually charge less for electricity locally, and we'd use a lot more of it. We could be in the North Highlands totally electric by now if we were allowed to actually access directly electricity that's being generated. Instead, general UK taxpayers pay full premium rate based on fossil fuel prices, of course, because the fossil fuel people still run the energy industry, and as a result, the companies make loads of money not giving electricity or any benefits to the communities or the areas that they're within. And just to give you a last fact, which is unbelievable in 2025, and that is that the reason why the North of Highlands has a higher electricity price is officially because, according to the generator, that they're further away from coal-fired power stations in Yorkshire, which are all shut now. Remember what I said about fossilised tax systems?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'll just try and bounce a few very short remarks. On the issues in Caithness and the Highlands, I mean, I hear very disturbing news about the response of communities to, a lot of communities are expressing the views that you are saying, and I think Satwat said it. I mean, the Shetland example is very, very clear. If communities feel a sense of ownership and benefit from it, then the decisions feel very, very different from if they're top down and imposed on. And I won't say any more than that, except that actually that's down to the weak-willed and laissez-faire attitude of the government, that in not expecting a greater level of community ownership in those developments. Gosh, I could start talking about nature markets, but I think it would be abusing my one minute. Just say that that whether it's voluntary or compliant, the Scottish government's considering putting, I think, quite a lot of effort and therefore money and time into developing a metric for a nature market. And I just want to say this sort of loudly again. Has anybody worked out the return on that investment? Because actually, until you start to say that there is going to be enough people, playing that game to generate a significant flow of money into nature, don't spend the money, Scottish Government. Spend it on something useful. But sorry, it's a bit provocative to say that at the very end, Peter.
You just got to make sure they make the market.
Yeah. So just lastly, the crucial question of how do we fix these problems? And just to say, the answer to that from Friends of the Earth Scotland is, having been working on climate change for a long time and playing a role in that, is it's gone well beyond playing the game of politics. It's gone well beyond the lobbying of politicians, good or badly intentioned. It requires that we have and we build a movement of people, of trade unionists, of communities, of community activists, of healthcare workers and health campaigners, a movement which is in an intelligent way for action. And we invite you to be part of that movement. We invite you to join an organisation, dare I say it, the very organisation I work for. But there are others available, and learn from. We all need to learn a lot about it. We are learning at this session. Learn about it and articulate those views in your communities, and indeed to your politicians, and indeed in the elections. So yeah, welcome to the movement. Let's build it.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panel. I've got a couple of things I just wanted to say, which is that in all of these discussions, there's such a strong focus on money and funding and the big gap between the scale of the problem and the funds currently available. So maybe indeed we do need to mobilise new finance, but I think we also need to stop digging the hole. And that means stopping all of the nature harmful finance flows in the form of subsidies, incentives, the wrong form of investments. The second thing, which I've certainly heard from our panel and from you, is the need for more ambitious and courageous political action, whether by our politicians and our government or by a set of academic and civil society groups, so that government hears and is able to respond to the desire for much greater courage and ambition in their actions. Finally, I just want to say thank you to our four panelists, to Peter, to Matthew, to Satwat, and to James, and to you in the room and online, and to the RSE, and to say that I hope very much we can continue these debates, particularly in the run-up to the Holyrood elections next year. We've heard from Satwat that there's a Just Transition Commission summit at the end of October, so let us know how we can join up with that. And maybe the RSE can have, a bit more of a proactive role in terms of connecting these various constituencies and debates. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you to the chair.